an artist whose current interest is in tattoo art. Her family lineage includes a number of individuals who hold the gift of second sight, and what many call or refer to as being sensitive. From the Commonwealth of Virginia, please welcome Pat and Stephanie Bussard.
I can tell you I wasn't that smart. I'd be a member of Mensa. Listen, I'm glad you're here today, and I'm certainly glad that I'm here, and I'd like to thank UPP for inviting us down to speak with you all. It's exciting for us. And we are going to take you back a few hundred years to a place and a time where death was common, where it was an everyday occurrence, where people lived with it, they breathed it, and they thought about it quite a bit. It was a time when death was grand and the dead were puppets. Woo! All right. The Victorian era, I don't want to bore you all, and that's another thing. I was telling him backstage, I said, now, I don't know about the academic credentials because people start cringing and thinking, oh my God, it's time to leave. I've had enough of that back in high school. But this is really interesting, I think, for us in the audience because we are the ones that are interested in the paranormal. I mean, it's like speaking to the choir. You know, and how did we get this whole concept, our modern concept of ghosts? A lot of it did come from this era. And there was a reason that there was so many dead and dying and so much focus. It was a death culture during the Victorian era. And so we're going to go over just a few of those ideas and concepts and historical events that led up to our modern concept of ghosts and hauntings. The Victorian era, sorry, I'm not as tall. The Victorian era, of course, was named after Queen Victoria. And if you'll notice, she was quite a plump little lady. She did not miss many meals. The Industrial Revolution occurred during that time, and I know that we've heard this back in our either high school or college years, but the Victorian era and the Industrial Revolution, there was a cost to that. You know, we talk about it in our classes, but we never talk about the human cost of it, or what it really meant. What happened is that the rich, just like today, wanted to go to their version of the Walmart. In other words, they started buying their goods from across the way, so to speak, in other European countries, anywhere where they could get it cheaper. And what happened is it no longer became feasible for farmers to farm. And what did they do? You know, I love it. When I was back in class, they would almost act like people were just chomping at the bit to get to those cities. You know, the land of opportunity. It wasn't like that. Cities were a last resort. It was nowhere you really wanted to be. And so they crowded into these factories. The towns quickly, in fact, London doubled in less than 10 years. Some of the smaller towns became cities. It wasn't uncommon for them to quadruple in the same amount of time. So you had an exploding population filled with very poor people. Technology and engineering started to change. I mean, think about it. People were on horseback. And that was considered a pretty fast mode of travel because most of us were on foot. Again, we had a lot of poor people, kind of like today. But all of a sudden, you had the iron horse. Think about it. You had your feet, you had a horse. And then all of a sudden, you had trains. That's a leap. That's as big a leap as going to the moon was for 1969. Think about it. So all of a sudden, we had changes in technology. We had the rise of the middle class. And guess what? When you have people, the nouveau riche, you have conspicuous consumerism. Now, that by itself is interesting, except all of a sudden, one of the best places you could put your money so the neighbors notice was in funerals. Conspicuous consumerism. And of course, there was that little thing of world domination. I mean, think about it. All of a sudden, it truly was a fact that the sun never set on the British Empire. The pride that these people felt, and there was a nationalism that ran through the country because now, not only do we own one quarter of the world's population, which at that time was 458 million people, but guess what? We also have a quarter of the Earth's total land mass. That's amazing. That's huge. That's a huge empire. And even today, did you all know that at the top of the heap of landowners in the world, Queen Elizabeth of England. So England was the epicenter of the world. I mean, they called the shots. English was the language of business, law, and government. And what did this mean? Well, okay, now we have all of the changes in technology. We have this whole idea that everything's change. We don't like change, do we, as human beings? It's natural to us because if we aren't changing, we're safe. We can stay where we are. We're safe. We'll stay in this cave. It's safe. But change is inevitable. And so everyone's crowded into cities. We have everybody very, very scared of all these changes. But the one thing that they could control was death and what they did with their dead. And there was a lot of dead. And how do we know? Well, let's look at it. In 1840s Whitechapel District, we're talking, if you were rich, you were part of the upper class. And don't forget, back in those days, the upper class was, you're either rich or you're poor. And before the middle class, now think of this, before the middle class, you had the aristocracy to have true money. So all of a sudden we have factories, all of a sudden we have people gaining money. You know, a whole class of people that did not have money before. So what are they going to do? They're going to look up to the aristocracy and say, aha, okay, you might have had the title, you may have lorded it over us, but now I can show that I have money. Why? Because when my loved one dies, it will be, 6 horses. I will give my loved one the status, deservedly, that had already been the venue of the rich. So even then, even if you did have money, your average lifespan was 45 years. Think about that. And then, if you were a tradesman, somebody that had a trade that you could sell, 27 years, because you had better living conditions. Laborers and servants, look at this, 22 years. 22 years. If you were mid-Victorian era, life expectancy of 26 years. Now let me ask you this. What's the difference? We've got 57 years if you were in the country. So we have all these discrepancies. What's the biggest discrepancy between the country and the city? Air, water, living conditions, absolutely. So now we've set up this cesspool of imminent death, even for the rich. But now I'll tell you, the rich live longer because of one thing, and that is, if you were poor, you were stuck in the city, weren't you? You didn't have a country house. And people who had money in the summer went to their country house because, believe you me, in the 19th century, the city stank. I mean, there was pure sewage running through the street. So that was nowhere that you wanted to be. Of course, they didn't really think about the health concept until a little later. At that point, it was all about the smell. Yes, I'm taking my rich schnoz and I'm going to the country. So, and another thing that's really interesting too about all of this death, and I'm trying to make this as lively as I can because we are talking about death. But the really interesting thing is, if you were in 1832 living in Liverpool, do you know what your average life expectancy was? No, this one's a hidden gem. Actually, believe it or not, if you were living in, and I should say the ghetto, okay, that could have been included, 15 years. 15 years was the average life expectancy because of infant mortality. And if you look at this, I mean, upper class, they lost 126 newborns, 126 per thousand. Working class, 274. Wow, look at that. You almost, pretty much almost tripled it, maybe 2.5 or 250%. And then look at this. If you were in the slums, 509 infant deaths per 1,000 births. Did you know that there was so much death in every class that as soon as children were born, they started saving for their funerals, even the poorest people, like we do for college educations today. They were dropping like flies. And here's some reasons. Archaic medicine, surgery, lack of antibiotics, childbirth was a big one, Waterloo teeth. Have any of you ever heard of Waterloo teeth? Well, once again, if you were wealthy and you had lost your teeth, you would go among the slums and you would find somebody who was poor with a lot of really nice teeth, and you would buy them from them. That's right. Kind of like surrogate mothers today. When you think about it, we go, oh, but think about that. Think what that would have sounded like to their generation. That's right, totally different. But they would go by them and they would give you medical care, you know, and try to make sure that you didn't die. And then they would take your teeth and put them into wood or walrus tusk or something and put them in their mouth. Waterloo teeth. The teeth of last resort. And of course we had poverty. There was no or bad food when they were lucky to get food. Lack of dependable heating systems. I mean, it's cold in England. I mean, these are poor people. And of course, lack of city planning, lack of drinkable water. I mean, I'm going to tell you something. There's something that is a little known bit of history back in good old Merry England called the Great Stink of 1858. What had happened is that people were, again, dying like flies, and it was due to dysentery. And what had happened, the municipal organization of the city would actually take water out of the Thames River and sell it to people. Unfortunately, for the people, that's where the raw sewage went, straight into the Thames. So yes, they're dying from this. Well, that was okay because, you know, the rich actually had a bit cleaner water supplies and didn't drink directly from the Thames, unfortunately, like the poor did. And so what happened, 53,000 estimated people died in London during a couple of years. That's a lot of people, isn't it? But who cares? They're poor. You can make more of those. In fact, they do. So they weren't really concerned about that. But let me tell you something. When it started to smell in 1858, during a nice warm spring when Parliament was still in session, and it was so bad, the stench from the Thames was so bad, that they actually dipped the curtains into, I think it was chloride lime, in order to kind of keep the smell from the very, well-to-do aristocracy. Unfortunately, it didn't work. It stunk. So they're crazy. Do you know, within 18 days, they had pushed through legislation that actually prevented leakage of raw sewage into the water. Totally different. Yeah, you affect them and they will change the laws. So, I know I mentioned poverty, we're going to talk about it again because it was such a life-sucking, grinding poverty that today most of us can't even imagine. And of course pollution, somebody mentioned air. We have air and water. There was no relief and no hope. Now I'll tell you, unless you were one of the burgeoning middle class that owned a factory, there used to be aristocracy and rich and then the poor. Now there's aristocracy, rich. We now have the middle class and the poor, which was really a burgeoning population. So it was relentless. There was nowhere for them to go. You couldn't go to college. You couldn't do anything to better yourself. You were stuck. It was a hopeless situation. So children who survived age 5, and that was big, but if you hadn't made it to age 5, you just